And we all know what happens when we see a Muslim character appear on the page. This is the bad guy. I know I've found him now. Now, in literature, sometimes formulas work, particularly in genre fiction. Formulas are really good. People like to read formulas. But I thought, well, what if we can turn this on its head? What if we can do a spy book that completely shifts things and says, no, the person that you've come to expect is the bad guy, is your hero, number one.
J.A. Walsh worked in intelligence and counterterrorism after the September 11th attacks. Purpose of Evasion is his first book in his Sami Lakhani thriller series. Sami is a new kind of spy hero, an American Muslim whose experiences are drawn from the author's own service in counterterrorism and inspired by some of the great writers and heroes of spy and political thrillers. William A. Gavin retired from the Federal Bureau of Investigation after 28 years. He served as an assistant director of New York, the Bureau's largest field office. He appears on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC as an analyst for terrorism and other criminal matters. Now please join me in welcoming J.A. Walsh and William A. Gavin.
Before we begin, I want to point out, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of Bill's background as we continue, but another author in our midst, so you can go up and ask. I'm sure you can order a copy of Bill's book for people if you don't have it on the shelves, Rebecca. So if you don't know what the term pick up your own brass means, I could explain that to you after our panel. And then, so excited and super proud to have my cousin here, another author whose book is on the shelf. This is one I just grabbed on the shelf, and you should support his writing as well. Best book of the year, Rolling Stone, Guardian, and elsewhere, and just an awesome story about an iconic album. And I showed this to the folks from WGBH who were here earlier, and they said, "Man, 1968. It's almost hard to remember all the stuff that happened that year and how significant a year it was." So thank you for being here, and everybody should buy that book too. So, all right. So let's get started. Keeping in mind that a lot of people maybe haven't read the book yet, let me set the scene for you. So we have Sami Lakhani, as Rebecca mentioned, a Muslim American intelligence officer, and he is faced with a challenge at the beginning of our story. He's given an assignment to stop a terror attack that seems to be emanating from the mosque in Greater Washington, D.C. area where he grew up. But as he gets into the investigation, he starts to uncover some connections that aren't making sense to him. And he chases those connections wherever they lead him, and they lead him to some pretty frightening places. And that's what happens in the story. But Sami is, like a lot of the characters in spy thrillers, someone who exists in sort of a netherworld of the intelligence and law enforcement community, the nexus where those two meet. So I'm not going to do too much reading, but I want to start by reading a little bit from the prologue of the book, and then getting you involved in the conversation, Bill.
Sure.
So this is in the prologue. This is page 3, and this is Gerald Seymour, who's a mysterious White House aide who has actually chosen, defying all conventional wisdom, to office in the Eisenhower Executive Office building just across the street from the White House. So he's sitting in his office late one night. He's just been handed a confidential document that has some potentially troubling information in it. And I think this is a great place to start our conversation. So, after 9/11, it became conventional Washington wisdom that the people who hated America would no longer express their feelings just by blowing up our embassies in the Middle East and Africa, and that the FBI needed to take on more counterterrorism and intelligence responsibilities. The problem with the FBI was they wanted to do things covert agencies had long done, but with a bias toward prosecution. The Hoover building was full of people who liked to arrest and indict and convict. Langley was different. The CIA traded in information. When they found no willing customer for their reporting, they sometimes conducted misadventures of their own, but their trade was secrets, not justice. They used secrets to compromise agents who were by definition liars and who in turn provided more secrets. If the CIA discovered that Mr. Bad Guy would like to harm America, they collected information about Mr. Bad Guy. Information, not evidence. If Mr. Bad Guy developed capabilities to harm America, they degraded those capabilities. If Mr. Bad Guy had actionable plans to harm America, they disrupted those plans. They might even kill Mr. Bad Guy, but they would not arrest him. Information was power, even if they never used it. Langley's approach suited Gerald Seymour much more than the FBI's. The J. Edgar Hoover building was an insult to its namesake, one of America's foremost secrets and lies blackmailers, forgive me. If the CIA had the same information included in the FBI memo Gerald was reading, the CIA would not have told the White House. Gerald would have found out because he had a guy at Langley too, but if he let this go any longer, the FBI would be handing this memo around Washington like homeless newspapers at a metro station. That's where I want to bring you in, Bill.
What does one say after that?
But to your credit, because the charge that you have is to fight crime.
And that was the big difference between intelligence gathering agencies and law enforcement agencies. We always looked at something that, how do I prove this case in a court of law? What does it fall under Title 18, Section so-and-so? And how am I going to get this guy in jail? With that, and that was kind of a database, a knowledge, skill, and a performance thing for up and through probably 1993 when the bombing of the World Trade Center occurred in New York.
So we didn't mention in your introduction, you retired from that office in New York.
I did.
You led that investigation after the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993.
I did. We had, in 1993, we had 7 individuals involved in the bombing of the Trade Center. And it was the very first time that big footprint of terrorism had stepped on the United States. And we kind of took it personally for some reason. And again, we were looking at it in those days as part of an investigative, put them in jail, gather evidence, not intelligence. And by so doing, I think we missed a whole segment of what we should have had. And in years to come after that, we worked, I think at the time we worked extremely well with other people. We were not focused. We didn't look at these cases through the prism of intelligence gathering. We looked at it through the prism of investigations and putting people in jail.
So the World Trade Center hits in 1993. The bombing occurs. As you said, we'd seen limited up to that point instances in the United States of lone wolf terrorism.
Correct.
This is a transnational terrorist organization or activity now fairly, what's the correct word? They weren't, these were not sophisticated
No, they were not.
attacks in many ways. 2 years later, the Oklahoma City bombing happens. Again, looking at it from the other perspective, which part of the book touches on, some far-right sympathies represented among McVeigh and Nichols, but they were just kind of goofballs that were able to build a fertilizer bomb.
They were, and they're the same kind of bomb in both cases, fertilizer and fuel oil mixed together made the witch's brew. And the difficult part about that was that the Bureau was still looking in the Oklahoma City case from a law enforcement perspective. We had in New York, we had police officers working in our office every single day, and somebody said, no, that can't be. Yeah, it was. They were there. We had 45 police officers came to work in the FBI office every single day. But still, we were carrying with that presence a law enforcement perspective, not an intelligence gathering. Even though those police officers were able to bring into the Bureau their knowledge of what went on in the mosque in Brooklyn, what went on in those kinds of communities, because they had the penetration of the places. So it was when we first started to learn that maybe looking at it from a different perspective. I think we were doing a fairly decent job at the cooperation side of things, but I think we have to remember at that time that we couldn't talk to intelligence gatherers.
Yeah.
It was a violation of the law to do it. So whatever I had, I couldn't give to CIA, and whatever CIA had, they couldn't give to me because it would violate the law and we'd both go to jail. It didn't make any sense, but it was the law of the United States. What happened subsequent to 9/11 was a whole change, and that law was repealed in a short amount of time, so we could officially talk to each other again, if that makes any sense.
I want to get to 9/11 in a minute because it's an interesting event in that it marks kind of the transition from your career and the duration of your work with the FBI and beginning of my career in intelligence. But I want to go back to one thing you just said a minute ago. So you talked about the efforts that local agencies, whether they're police or your own agents, made to infiltrate and get embedded in the mosques in Brooklyn where these attacks were at least partially conceived.
Correct. Omar Abdul Rahman was the blind sheikh that was in Brooklyn at the time, and the local police detectives that worked in the FBI every single day had knowledge of what he was doing and were able to develop that kind of information that became productive as time went on.
So one of the things that I hear a lot about the book, when people react to the book, they'll say, wow, a Muslim American intelligence officer, that's different. Isn't that interesting? And I said, no, not really. Guess what? I never had the opportunity to infiltrate Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of the other groups that were operating in Central Asia and through the Middle East. I wouldn't have had very much success trying to convince someone that I had been a multi-generational Waziri family. Can you talk about, maybe in the context of the book, but certainly in the context of your investigation, the members of these communities? We hear about the 4 or 12 people who are convicted of carrying out these attacks, but what about all the members of the community who support the investigations and who are integral to?
And that's what became so important. One thing that isn't always stressed is the main informant in the resolution of not only the February 1963 bombing of the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, but also preventing the subsequent attack, which was going to be at the United Nations garage, the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel, and something near and dear to my heart, 26 Federal Plaza. That's where I worked, and so I had a real interest in that. But the bottom line is, the one who brought us to a point where we could do what the FBI did at that time, and that's make the arrest and prosecute, was a person of Arabic descent. It was the main source of information in that case, and we were able to get tapes of their plans driving through the Holland Tunnel saying, this is how we will do this. It's live on tape. So it was, back then it was still a point where we had to, where people like this came along, people in the community were of huge assistance. And we tend to forget that, we think that that resolving these things is all the clever work of intelligence gatherers and gun toters. It's not. It's the American people that come forward, step forward, and decide it's my turn to step to the plate.
Yeah. So the 1993 attacks, people may not know or may not remember, but the through line between those attacks and 9/11 is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
It is.
I want to come back in a few minutes to talk about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who people may not know, considered to be the mastermind of the attacks on 9/11, remains alive, sitting in a prison cell under the control of the United States government. People, Saddam Hussein's dead, Osama bin Laden's dead. Looking back at the post-9/11 foreign policy and national security, everything that's happened since 9/11, this man remains alive, and it points up, I think, some really tricky issues.
And I think people can remember him because I think you saw him more than anybody else, the disheveled guy with a big hairy chest, and that's KS. Yeah,
John Belushi. Yeah.
That's KSM.
That's why they never did a biopic, because John Belushi wasn't able to play KSM.
And as Joe said, he's the thread because he was the uncle of Ramzi Youssef, who was the ringleader of the bombing in 1993. That was his uncle.
So I want to take us to 9/11. You and I have spoken about it. 9/11 changed my entire life. It was the seminal event. I think there are generations of Americans for whom Pearl Harbor is the event that they divide their life before and after. John F. Kennedy's assassination for many. For me, 9/11 changed everything about my life. Culturally, I think it's impossible to overstate the significance of that event. In terms of the work that people like you and I do, it's impossible, I think, to overstate the significance of that event.
Correct.
The difference, and to the extent that there's any autobiography in here, Sammy's life has been defined by that event as well.
It has.
Both in terms of what it means for him professionally as an intelligence officer and what it means for him as a Muslim American citizen of the United States.
And I suspect everybody who's read the book also can say the same thing about Sammy. That you can identify with what he identified with during the course of this time frame.
From the law enforcement intelligence perspective, 9/11 changes everything because the World Trade Center attack is really, as you said, that first footprint, but a little sloppy. We, as Americans, had come to see sophisticated, organized terrorism happening overseas, and we thought of organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah that would carry out attacks like that.
Correct.
9/11 is the first time that we see a sophisticated, organized, transnational organization plan, conceive, and carry out attacks in the United States. I know that you had retired by then, but I'm sure your ear was to the ground. Can you talk about, you mentioned before, this line between and the struggle that Gerald is having with his nefarious intentions inside of that office that evening at the beginning of the book is, the FBI are my law enforcement guys here in this country. I have my CIA intelligence guys who look at overseas threats. What happens when that threat comes ashore? Can you talk about the pace of change after those attacks?
There was a sea change. The bottom line is that when this occurred, it impacted on everybody's life in the United States, I think. Everybody can remember that, the horror of watching a plane go into a building, the horror that occurred afterwards, the look on the families of the victims' faces. How did that change the way law enforcement and intelligence agencies operated? Everybody had to push in the clutch and shift into high gear and decide maybe just Title 18, putting somebody in jail, isn't the way to do this. We have to gather intelligence. And it's not only gathering intelligence, it's what in God's name do you do with it? And today, the thing that I think we've spoken about, the rate at which we can gather intelligence is astronomical. We can't it's like stuffing your mouth with your favorite food, and you can't swallow it all at once. And that's the way the intelligence agencies are today. A lot of information coming forward. What do we do with it? How do we use it? And is some of it going to go by the way because we can't make it actionable? We can't digest it. We can't turn it into something that's usable because we can't translate it rapidly enough. Those are difficult things that we face today that started to occur when 9/11 occurred.
So one of the ways that we post 9/11 in terms of public policy tried to address that was the expansion of special access programs that were operating in the intelligence world. So very briefly, an intelligence special access program is Congress saying, intelligence agencies, you have the authority to collect information, but we've given you this authority and now you can go do your thing without acknowledging these programs, right? So in other words, this is the sort of what you read about as a black operation, right? So Congress expanded the opportunity for INSAPs. They were concerned about these attacks, again, threatening the United States. I think what's very interesting about the cultural shift that we've had post 9/11 in the United States is that we've all become attuned to the idea of what people may not know, but what is in fact Salafi, jihadi, transnational terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Lashkar-e-Taiba, such organizations. And the 1% doctrine prevailed, which was there's a very small chance that some of these guys who are really bad guys could do something very bad inside of the United States again, and we can't allow that to happen. The fact remains that 99.9% of victims of those organizations of their terror are other members, they're co-religionists, they're other members of the Muslim faith that live in the places where these organizations operate. But we made this shift, we attuned ourselves very much to that threat. From the law enforcement perspective, does that mitigate in any way the lone wolf threat, which continues, which is really what we had seen up to 9/11 and what I think most law enforcement people recognize as sort of the unstoppable threat today still?
There's a couple of things there, I think, with this newfound authority to do the kinds of things in the intelligence world. You had to be real sure that you fully understood the rights of American citizens. That's an important part of this whole thing. You just can't take this newfound authority and run wild with it and say, this is what we're going to do because Congress said we could do it. You've got to live by a set of morals and a set of common sense and a sense of decency. And to look at the other thing that we weren't prepared for in the law enforcement world was these individuals, the lone wolf, which is maybe a misnomer in some ways, but the lone wolf aspect. These are extremely dangerous people. Because when somebody does something like the first bombing, as Joe says, they're a little sloppy about it. We could trace where they bought all these things. They were talking to each other all the time, and we could listen to what they were. So you were able to catch them fairly easily. 9/11, more protracted longer. Their thought was after the first one, when they weren't successful, they were going to bring this down. We didn't see that from a law enforcement perspective, but that's what it was. I didn't do it the first time, I'm going to do it the second time. And they trained everybody in the United States to fly planes. They had this transnational thing, bringing people from all over the place to do these kinds of things. And I don't think, I know that the bureaus, from the bureau standpoint, we didn't catch them doing it. And I believe that now there's a greater emphasis within the intelligence communities, plural, to do a much better job at resolving these kinds of things. And maybe there are some ugly things that happen as a result of it.
So hence the Joint Terrorism Task Force, hence the National Counterterrorism Center, organizations like that are represented by intelligence agencies, local law enforcement, national, federal law enforcement agencies coming together to try to eliminate the stovepiping that had occurred before 9/11. I want to shift gears a little bit, get back into the book. So the reason that SAMI exists, his work is what it is because of this question of intelligence operations are the way that we frame intelligence operations, the way that the rules have been created is that we are protecting U.S. sovereignty and national security, and we'll do very nearly anything it takes overseas to make sure that we protect that, often in conjunction with our allies.
Correct.
But the rules are different because these aren't U.S. citizens. They are people who are threatening the safety of U.S. citizens. Even people with such intentions inside of the United States, whether they're citizens or not, if they're in the United States, there are certain protections that are in place. So I want to shift gears a little bit because that's Sammy's challenge, right? So he's got to balance out and weigh and work within these rules to figure out there's a real threat, but it's inside of the United States, and what can we do to, the ticking time bomb scenario, what can we do to prevent this attack while making sure that we don't lose sight of the best ideals of our country.
And I think Samir is probably a little imbued with his heritage. He understands that when something like this occurs in country X, their theory of interviewing and interrogation is perhaps a little different than ours, and we could label it as barbaric. And so, how do you, if somebody that we're interested in collectively comes into the hands of one of these groups or one of these countries that has their own form of justice, what do we do about that? Particularly, what do we do about it if it's a United States citizen that comes into? We have extraterritorial jurisdiction and things like that, but you really have to think about. They're going to get something out of them, but how are they going to get it out of them? Through some horrid means that they have to do it. And we were talking earlier when one of the subjects of the first bombing in '93 came back. It was hideous. He came back. I went to Cairo to get him, and it was just a horrible set of facts. We brought him right to a hospital. But those kinds of things, and Sami has to get all of this clear in his mind, and he's constantly bumping into the roadblocks of his, I won't say bias, but his own cultural things that he runs into. And it's a great story, and because it makes you go beyond what's on the written page, it makes you think outside those pages and think about, geez, what's the point here? And the point is fairly poignant. You just have to drop back and think about it, and maybe wait and see what happens in the next book, huh?
Bill, you're a better salesman than I am on the books. I got a lot to learn.
Modesty's good for you. It's not good. I have none.
Yeah. So let's go back to that conversation about U.S. citizens, because I want to shift a little bit to the foe that Sami faces as the story unfolds. So I have a little bit of data. As I talked about, post 9/11, the narrative that we've all become accustomed to is that there are threats from organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others, and we should be aware of those threats on the homeland. And a lot of the National Counterterrorism Strategy that came out in October, 98% of that document is focused on these organizations.
Right.
But when you look at data, the GAO put out a study in November. Since 9/11, domestic terror attacks, the the fatalities, the death toll attributed to those domestic terror attacks in the United States since 9/11 is almost evenly split, 50-50, in terms of being attributed to Salafi jihadist transnational organizations, usually inspired. So in the case of the San Bernardino attacks, there were some inspiration connections to some of these organizations. They had found speeches given by Anwar al-Awlaki on his computers, but there's no evidence or indication that he'd been trained by these organizations or any connection to those organizations. The other 50% of the fatalities belong to far-right, or so-called far-right nationalist, white nationalist groups. When you take out, not that we should take out any of these or discount any of these fatalities, but when you take out the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, 47 fatalities, the numbers greatly shift toward the white nationalist groups and their death toll. So, I don't know. You know, Sammy, in the conversation we just had a few minutes ago with the folks from WGBH, I thought they put it well that there are organizations represented in this country that have existed for a long time that are now being fostered online in greater numbers than ever, who are very much the other side of the coin from Al-Qaeda and ISIS in terms of the way that they view the world and their beliefs. What do you think about, so, you know, 95 Oklahoma City bombing, we've had isolated attacks since then. What are your thoughts on that risk, particularly as it relates to the question that you've just pointed up, which is we've been very concerned about you know, foreign fighters coming to the United States and carrying out attacks. These folks are U.S. citizens. They're afforded all the rights of U.S. citizens. You talk about, I guess, the law enforcement challenges of facing that kind of a...
The law enforcement challenges are real, and how do we face those challenges? It's not an easy task. We would like to just step in and do what maybe some of the foreign countries do and eliminate the problem. It's done. It's over with. It's not a prolonged trial. There's no extended jail time.
In some cases, our allies. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and so we have to look at it from that perspective, and it's not an easy task these days. And when you look at the white supremacist organizations and whatnot, I mean, you don't know where they're coming from. You can't always. Some of them you can tell because they're almost as unsophisticated as the bombers in '93. You know, so getting information on them. But individuals, one individual deciding I'm going to do X, Y, Z, not easy to ferret out.
Yeah. So Charleston, Christchurch, even with the death toll.
Yep.
Charlottesville, Pittsburgh synagogue, etc. When you tell someone those numbers and say, look, these fatalities 50-50, people sort of shake their head and it doesn't make sense. But then you start reeling off that roster now, which is getting pretty grim of those attacks. So what about, we've talked a little bit about the wall between law enforcement and intelligence operations, and one of the phrases you've heard me say over the 2 days now that we've spent time together, probably 10 times, is, you know, we don't have secret police in this country, right? There are so many other places that we all, I think, feel blessed not to be living, where dissent is crushed of all kinds. What about the question of speech, the guaranteed rights of free speech, which you know, I would stack myself. There's nobody in this room who believes more strongly than I do that people should be able to go as closely as they can to that line of free speech and be able to say whatever they want to say. That's what makes this country great. I've said it many times, we don't need protections on free speech for things that people like, right? What we need protections for are the things that people don't want to hear. But we're seeing, and I guess the best example that we have is in the case of the National Front in the UK, an organization that really has been organizing disaffected, economically disadvantaged white men, online chat rooms, beginning to foster discussion, not just about nationalism, but about a whole bunch of other stuff, you know, kind of forbidden sexual fantasies and other kinds of things, creating this community that sort of allowed people to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. They enact an attack and kill Joe Cox, a member of parliament in England. Mm-hmm. How do we balance?
It's a very delicate balancing act. There's nothing more precious than the freedom of speech, to be able to say what you want to say, short of crying fire in a movie theater, which is, we can all understand that. But there are other things that you say, I don't think somebody should be allowed to say that. Yeah, they can say it. It's a freedom of speech. So where do we stick our nose under the tent where somebody comes with and just kind of tests the water, puts their toe over the line to see what it's like saying something, see if anybody reacts to it, or somebody just jumping in up to their ankles and wading through it a little bit? Where do we start to look at or do something positive in those areas without it violating those rights? It's a very delicate balancing act today, and it takes a bunch of outstanding people who do the investigations and who gather the intelligence. The intelligence gathering is more important today than it has ever been. How do we put all these pieces of intelligence, these little tiny things that make no sense when you first hear them? We've all been through life like that, where somebody says something, you say, I don't know what the heck that meant. And about 3 days later, something happens, and you say, that's what that meant. That's what they were talking about. That's how the intelligence agencies are today, and the intelligence gathering is. And where do we take that scintilla of information and put it into the piece of puzzle and say, I think we got to do something about this. And then you say, what is it we do?
Right. Yeah, it's really tricky, right? So we mentioned earlier, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is still sitting in a cell in Guantanamo Bay because it's not clear what we can do with him. We don't really want to try him in a U.S. court. We certainly don't want to release him to an international criminal court. He's sitting in a sort of a netherworld. It gets tricky when it's your own, even trickier when it's your own citizens. There's a story that I take and use in the book, or refer to in the book. Junaid Hussain was a UK national who was really is credited with being the hacker who brought ISIS into the preeminent position that they held in terms of being the global online jihadi group. He was the hacker who was able to figure out how to set up the VPNs and proxies that would get their information out onto the internet to be heard and seen. And the UK intelligence officials had found him, had located him in Yemen, but he was a UK national. And so they came to us and said, we have this problem. This is a guy, and we don't really want to, same thing I think that problem that we would have. This is one of our citizens. And so we decided to step in. We felt that he represented enough of a threat globally that we decided to step in and target a missile to kill Junaid Hussain. When that became public in the UK, there was a public outcry among citizens in the UK. We carried out a similar attack a couple of years later under President Obama on al-Awlaki as well. But these instances still don't capture the complexity because they weren't in the country. They were outside, operating against the United States outside of our country.
And we're faced with it. We're faced with a huge problem right now. There's an individual in the arms of Iran named Bobby Levinson, a retired Jewish agent from Miami who worked for me. Outstanding guy, smart as a whip. At the time that he went to Kish, the island of Kish, which is Iranian controlled, but probably like a neutral zone, trade-free zone, he was snatched. And there's enough information that we were able, I was out of the Bureau by then, but sometimes you get reeled back in again. There's enough information at that point in time to know that he was taken to Iran at that particular point in time. If in fact we're faced with the ability to do the same thing to them, what do we do?
Right.
Do we take somebody like that and just hold them incommunicado? This family has not heard anything from Bobby since 2007. They've sent pictures of him where he's got a beard down to here. They sent pictures of him, some voice recordings, please help me, please get me out. Everybody's petitioned the State Department and nobody has been able to get him out. What do we do in a similar situation? Do we grab somebody and treat them that way? That's not who we are. And say, well, yeah, but they're not fair to him. No, that's true. How do we handle it?
Maybe there's a section here that we could read from
Maybe there is.
To conclude, because I think it's a question of people doing the kind of work that you did and the kind of work that I was engaged in. We're there because we want to serve our country. Mm-hmm. We feel that we've been blessed and privileged to be afforded all the freedoms of this country. it's time for us to step up and fight for them and defend them. And we want to protect those freedoms and protect the people who enjoy them. By the same token, I think, particularly with intelligence operations, you get into a place where you start asking yourself, what are we willing to trade in order to protect those freedoms?
Correct.
So Sammy is in a climactic moment of the story here. Samir has confronted the folks who are intending to carry out this attack, and he's thinking about what he's personally traded, but also what the country maybe is trading. And so he's thinking back on his own identity and what it means to him as an American intelligence officer. The ones coming now would be outcasts, just like the Irish and the Italians and the Jews and the Chinese and the Latinos. They would be hated and they would live miserable, poor, unhealthy lives, picking other people's strawberries or mowing their lawns. But their kids would be Americans. And God had nothing to do with it. They made that luck. That was what he honored. He represented a place where anyone could do that. Make a life, change the future. That was why he did what he did, which his grandfather never understood. That was why he didn't regret it, any of it. The bombs over Baghdad, the millions displaced, the creation of ISIS, the drone strikes that sometimes kill children. He didn't regret it because America intended none of those consequences. Collateral damage was a painful euphemism, but it wasn't a lie. America tried. I think we mostly try.
We do. We try hard. We stumble sometimes, and sometimes our enthusiasm to resolve problems quickly takes us down the wrong path. But America is such a strong country and has such a great, I think, a great moral compass overall. There are certainly exceptions to that, but I think as a whole, the country has a great moral compass, and it's going to prohibit them from doing some of the things that are done in other countries and somehow infuriate some of our residents because they don't take that kind of an action. But going down that path, taking that kind of an action is a destiny we don't want to face.
So I have some more stuff we could talk about, but we've been going for about 35 minutes, and I would love to get some questions and have some conversation. And has anybody got questions?
There are a number of gatekeepers, and sometimes that's a problem. Yet sometimes that's a safety valve as well. Some of the information that's gathered that's not made actionable because it's so voluminous, but becomes actionable after we learn other facts. Some of that's kept by one group. Another group does things a little bit differently. But I think it'd be kind of fraught with danger to have just one group of people do all those kinds of things, because then they become a little bit bigger than they really are, and they're liable to do those kinds of things that we're talking about that are going to stump on the civil rights of people in this country, things that we hold dear.
Yeah, so there are two, and mindful that we have a camera here, I'll just repeat. So the question was, who's the gatekeeper of all this information that's collected? And I think it's a really important question from two perspectives. One, as you started to talk about, Bill, is privacy. And so many of us have heard about programs that have been launched either under the authorization provided by the Patriot Act, so metadata collection programs, the collection of every phone call that you make to who and who they make a phone call to, and the collection of that data, which can be very important in investigations like Bill's team carried out in 1993. Who do we know that's connected to whom? One of the things that they train us on at the Army Intelligence School at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, is how to do network mapping so that we can map a network and try to understand who's connected to whom. So really important in terms of making sure that we're not overreaching, that someone's keeping track of whose information is being collected and making sure it's not being collected for the wrong reasons or being collected anywhere further than it needs to be to secure the country. The other reason that's super important, as Bill referred to, is before 9/11, what information he was collecting didn't come to my side of the house, and what information I was collecting didn't go to his side of the house. Now, there are really, really good reasons that was in place. People that are authorized to collect information under the Defense Authorization, under the Defense Intelligence Agency's auspices, are not allowed to collect information on U.S. persons, and there's really good reasons for that, like the McCarthy hearings, right? So there's good reasons why we don't do that. However, we knew about bin Laden, and we knew about Mohammed, and we knew about people on the intelligence side of things. and those folks were living in the United States, and they were carrying out lives in the United States, and we were stovepiped and weren't able to share that information across the line to people who might have been able to effectively interdict those attacks.
Collectively, perhaps something could have been done where you share that kind of information, but it was so frustrating to both of us. It was so frustrating not to be able to tell each other the truth that could perhaps resolve something before it occurred. Sometimes it didn't happen until the horror occurred, and we all felt terrible about that, but there wasn't a lot you could do about it at that specific point in time, and thank God they changed that law.
Yeah. So I can tell you, it was, as Bill said, they changed things very quickly after 9/11, statutorily. At a operational level, things took a little bit longer. So there were instances between sort of 2004-5 where we were working on teams in SCIF. So SCIF is a secured compartmented information facility. So a TSSCI information is held in these classified rooms or buildings. And you'd be working there with a multifunctional team, defense intelligence folks, civilian intelligence folks, law enforcement, and there would be a new decree that would come down saying, well, you can share some information, but you can't share all the information, or you can't share this type of information, or you need to redact X, Y, and Z. And it became really challenging because the person who was running that SCIF, who was my team commander, was an FBI agent. So I don't know from Monday to Friday what information I'm permitted to share with the person who's giving me my tasking. So yeah, really tricky, and that gatekeeping question is huge. Yeah. So the question is, the character is a gay Muslim American man. How does that work? Well, as we all know, it works. That's the way that life is. I firmly believe that, and I wanted to represent. There's a couple reasons the character is who he is. Sort of three reasons. There's the genesis of the story reason, which is that when I was asked, why don't you think about writing a spy book, my initial reaction was, there's lots of really good spy books out there. I'm not sure that me adding another spy book to the pile is really a great idea. But then I started thinking about it some more, and I thought, well, geez, we all kind of know who the spy book hero is, right? We all know what he looks like. We all know sort of his physical features. We all know what he can do with a toothpick when on top of a moving train to 10 guys who are trying to attack him. We all know what's going to happen when he goes to the bar at night in the hotel, or whatever exotic city that he's in. So I thought, and we all know what happens when we see a Muslim character appear on the page. This is the bad guy. I know I've found him now. Now, in literature, sometimes formulas work, particularly in genre fiction. Formulas are really good. People like to read formulas. But I thought, well, what if we can turn this on its head? What if we can do a spy book that completely shifts things and says, no, the person that you've come to expect is the bad guy, is your hero, number one. Number two, this is representative of the people that, in my opinion, A, the people that I served with, and B, the people who I think are sacrificing the most to protect the ideals of our country. So I wanted to represent those people in this book. And then third, it was really important to me that Samir be on an island, that Sammy didn't have anywhere that he felt he could run, right? So he feels estranged from his religious community, and particularly from his grandfather, who's an important figure in his religious community. He feels estranged from, or he feels at many instances that he's part of a machine that's waging war against his own faith and people around the world that are similar to him. And so when this mission comes to him, when he's presented with this challenge, I really wanted this guy to feel like there's no place to run. And I hadn't thought of this, but you gave me a great tool here. Unlike, so he's the lone wolf intelligence officer instead of the lone wolf terrorist, right? So he's kind of out there on his own. And so it was important to me that he really be adrift and at sea. And I think, his identity and what it means personally and what it means in 2019 and 2020 and 2021 in the United States to be a Muslim American gay man who works for the government and who is a recent immigrant to this country. I'm writing a series of books, and so that obviously is going to come back and give us a lot to explore. A little bit of a challenge in one of the questions that we've talked about earlier is, am I really the best guy to write a gay Muslim American spy? At least I was a spy, right? I was an intelligence officer, so that's good. But But so I'm hopeful that 5 years or 10 years from now, Sammy is going to be one of several characters that are on the shelf that look and sound and talk and are the kind of person that Sammy is. So
I think it was a bold move to give these attributes to the person in this book that when you open it, okay, we've identified the bad guy. We got that bias. So you set that aside. And you say, well, he's gay. So there's something the matter with him. Now you got to set that. I think probably as the development of Sami Lakhani goes down the road, we're going to see those things as both positive and negative. What is it that you can do? And I'm sure Joe will develop those kinds of concepts. How do we handle this when this comes up to be a perceived problem and ends up to be an asset as opposed to something that's negative?
yeah, so it's important.
And it's like life, you know.
So here's a guy who's been told by the people who raised him that he's not, something's wrong with him, right? And so I wanted to make sure that I developed a person who independently proved to himself, as importantly as everybody else, his value. It's also, so you mentioned, the first chapter, there's a little prologue, which I read to you from. The first chapter is Sammy walking with his backpack, and you see a person who fits his description and with a person with his name, and he's walking with his backpack, and in this backpack he has a weapon. And every publisher fought me about this chapter. They wanted to take it out. They wanted to move it later in the book. They wanted to, and I said, no, I want to challenge readers to think, wait a minute, what you're telling me is this guy has, the weapon that's in his backpack is not an IED. It's the means to target a drone strike 7,000 miles away to kill dozens of people. Who's the soldier? Who's the freedom fighter? Who's the terrorist? Who's doing what here? And where do we fit? And how does identity sort of get sliced and diced? So I think we'll do one more before I sweat through my suit. And man, do I love this question. Because it lets me say, yeah. Bill has said,
He's a ventriloquist. He wasn't really answering the question.
So Bill has said, read the next book. You've just teased everybody the next book. So Sammy's next adventure is he's headed to Silicon Valley because who in the world other than these 5 companies are more well suited to collect and gather and analyze all this data? It's what they do. It's what they're there to do. It's what they exist to do. And so there's going to be some challenges out there that Sammy's going to have to go to tackle. But I think, so what you point up, the challenge that you identify, is the reason that inevitably, 3 days after an attack, we discover that so-and-so had been on the radar, or FBI agents had been to interview and question this person. And what sort of gets lost in that discussion in the Storm and Drang 3 days after an attack is, well, yeah, they went and interrogated or questioned that person, and there was, no probable cause or reasonable suspicion to move forward with anything beyond that. But yeah, there's just a ton of data and there's a ton of information out there, so it's really difficult to know which vocally violent person is going to take the next step and move to. Now, obviously, the internet has exacerbated that problem. The real challenge that we have on the cyber side right now is we do as good a job as we can of trying to ferret out the locations where the really dangerous folks are moving around on the dark web and having discussions that are about actionable steps. But the nature of the dark web is that they can pop up another place to have that discussion very quickly. So yeah, what's the kind of corruption of the familiar phrase, right? We often are stuck in a place where we're searching for needles and stacks of needles, right? Is the problem. So,
Agreed.
Mr. Nelson.
A little bit of background on Bobby. When he worked for me in Miami, Miami was narcotics. That's what it was about. And Bobby taught himself how to speak Spanish. He never went to school, learned how to speak Spanish, did a great job at undercover, and did those kinds of things. A very creative guy. Then when Russian organized crime came on the scene, Bobby taught himself how to speak Russian, and that's not an easy task either. He did those kinds of things. He became very astute at it. He retired from the Bureau, and he went to work for the agency, and that's what happened. And while he was in Kish doing something at their behest, he was snatched. And They've been offered lots of money to get him back again, and it hasn't taken. It's tragic. He's got grandchildren, sons-in-laws, daughters-in-law that will never know this man or have never known this man. Hopefully, he comes back into the fold of his family.
Publicity about him, is that intentional?
The lack of publicity, it's not within the sector of the intelligence and the law enforcement folks. It's there all the time. There's always pictures of him. Every single month something comes out on him. Every time they talk about somebody that's in Iran, to give them back a negotiating for somebody to be moved back into Iran and somebody else to be moved back into another country, Bobby's name never comes up. Why? Is he still alive? Possibility he isn't. Possibility that the Iranians sold him to somebody else as a little pawn to play with. But it's just a horrible set of circumstances for the family.
What does this book mean?
What's that?
You said you'd explain.
Oh, would you like to explain, Bill? So pick up your own brass. Does anybody have a guess? What's brass? Your shell. When you go to the range, you go to the range. You discharge all this brass. I assume you're talking about at the range when everybody's qualifying every year.
True.
Yeah.
And the reason we entitled that is there's so many people, managers, leaders, not leaders, let's say managers, because there's a big difference between a leader and a manager. And some of them don't even go to the range. They're the boss. They fire and walk away and let somebody pick up the, no, pick up your own brass. Leadership the FBI way is the name of the book.
So there we go. And don't forget about Ryan's book. And thank you so much again. I have to tell you, it may sound like a silly thing or seem obvious, but until I was doing this, I didn't appreciate what it means for someone to buy a book. I mean, how significant that is, what it means to the person who created it, what it means to the editors who edited it, what it means to the publisher and to all the people who work, trying to put out, nobody tries to put out stinky books, right? We all work really hard to try to put out great books. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for supporting me in this book. Appreciate it.